Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagano, and welcome back to another fun-filled, action-packed episode of Iowa's most explosive conservative podcast. We are joined here today in studio by Alan Ostergren from Kirkwood Institute.
Thanks for having me back on, Chris.
You. First things first, Alan, glad to have you back. What is new at Kirkwood Institute?
Well, we just filed a lawsuit against the Health Facilities Council, partnered with a group called the Pacific Legal Foundation, which is an excellent public interest law firm policy group. And despite its name, it really has a nationwide scope. We are suing the Health Facilities Council over Iowa's Certificate of Need law, which is a statute that says we're going to reduce and control the cost of health care by reducing and controlling the supply of health care. And if you've taken at least 5 minutes of economics in your life, you would understand that that doesn't make any sense, that you would reduce costs by increasing the supply, not decreasing it. We're very proud to represent 2 midwives who want to open a birth center. This is a really hot issue in Iowa right now. There's a real loss of access to birthing services in rural Iowa in particular. For most births, it's not only is it just as safe, it's often safer than having a hospital birth to go to a midwife and have birth in a birth center or at home. There's no reason why you can't do that. This lawsuit raises some important questions about what does the Iowa Constitution mean for the right to earn a living? What does it mean for equal protection? This is a statute that the established players in the healthcare industry use to keep out competition. You know, the obstetricians and the hospitals, they don't want midwives delivering babies for a tiny, tiny fraction of the cost that it is to do it in the hospital. So I'm super excited about this case. We've been working on it for quite a while. We have great clients. It's a great issue. This is something that completely crosses over any kind of partisan line. That's the part that well, in addition to the merits of the case, I thought was pretty interesting is it really does cut across the political spectrum and the ideological, spectrum, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. And there's a lot of folks out there across the spectrum that have used a midwife or appreciate midwifery or whatever it is. And so access to that is important. It is. We're looking forward to making those arguments in the Iowa courts. I'm very comfortable with the idea that our Constitution protects the right to earn a living. There's language in the Constitution to that effect. You have the right to pursue your lawful occupation. That doesn't mean there's no government regulation of any kind. We're not saying that. But it's not the government's business to tell you can't earn a living. And in fact, that is protected. And I think it's worth remembering that every single person who participated in the drafting and ratification of our state constitution and our federal constitution was born outside of a hospital.
Well said.
So I'm excited about this case. I've been kind of geeking out on midwifery, learned a lot more about it than I knew at the beginning of this process. I can tell you.
Mainly looking for an opportunity to highlight to our listeners that I knew that the term was midwifery and that's how it was pronounced.
It took me about 6 months to pronounce it correctly.
Okay,
it doesn't roll off the tongue.
Good. Well, I know when we were talking in the pre-production meeting and when I knew you were coming in the office, you had some thoughts about some of the topics and things that have been going on lately that Iowans for Tax Relief has worked on. Specifically, a few weeks ago was educational savings accounts. And then more recently, we've been on some of these property tax issues. And that there's actually a common theme through that maybe we need to explore a little bit and what lessons can be learned from what's going on here. And so I think it's an interesting point is like, what should local governments be doing as part of this effort to save property tax dollars, to bend down the spending curve? Yeah. And maybe I'll preface it like this, that I have said repeatedly. State government in Iowa has done a fantastic job over the past, pick your time period, several years of limiting the growth in the state budget and then having that work to the benefit of the taxpayer to set the stage for a series of large income tax reductions because they held the line on spending. And it's time for local governments to do the same. Unfortunately, they have not yet done that. At least there are some good actors out there, but by and large, they have not. So I'm going to let you kind of start us off on that and share some of your thoughts.
A million years ago, I got my first lawyer job working for the county attorney in Muscatine. And one of the opportunities I got early on in my career was to participate in our state prosecutor association, Iowa County Attorneys Association, on the legislative committee. And I learned a lot of important lessons working on that legislative committee as an assistant and then carrying over to being the elected. And I was on that committee for probably 19 out of my 22 years as a prosecutor. I think we were a pretty effective organization at the Capitol, not because we had a well-financed PAC, not because we were partisan. I mean, we were frankly studiously not partisan. But one of the things that we were always effective at was listening to concerns from legislators and being willing to respond to them and come up with policy proposals, compromises, new language in the code, that we were there not just to say, no, we're not going to do something. No, we're against change. I was thinking about this when I was watching Governor Reynolds and her Condition of the State address. And people may recall, or not, you can go back and look. She started with some recent history of how collective bargaining reform went in 2017. Republicans took the majority in the state Senate. And Governor Reynolds reminded people that a lot of the political opposition then was over the top. The world will end if you reform collective bargaining. And here we are 6 years later, and those collective bargaining reforms happened, and things worked pretty well. Carry that over to the school choice reform debate. There's been a variety of policy proposals out there to reform schools, to get competition, to give more options to families for private education or open enrollment, all those things. And what you see time and time again over that policy debate was the government school monopoly stakeholders, essentially, the teachers union, the school boards, and their friends, saying, oh, the world will end if you do anything to reform education. I mean, let's think back to 2 years ago. The governor had a very modest proposal. The lowest performing schools for poor kids could get some ESAs and get out. And the government school monopoly said, hell no, we're not going to do that. And then last year, the proposal was capped at 10,000 students, also with income limits. And the government school monopoly said, hell no, we're not going to do that. Well, guess what happened? You keep saying no, you keep refusing to engage, you don't acknowledge that anyone has any kind of legitimate criticism or concern about what's going on. And eventually the political will coalesces and the reform is done without your input. And that's what happened this year. Historic, the best, most universal education reform package in the country.
I can tell you from my own experience, and look, I was the majority leader in the House when we passed the collective bargaining bill. But before that, that happens. And maybe it's not on the high profile bills always, but you need to come to the table if you want to be part of figuring out the solution. And you need to read the room that this is happening. So you're exactly right.
You can kill a policy initiative for one session. I mean, if your group has any kind of organization, if you have any kind of sophistication, you can kill something for a year. But you come back the second year and this idea is kicking around, it's a little bit harder. Maybe you can kill it 2 years in a row. And here's the thing that people need to understand about the legislative process. There's way more good ideas for reform than there is time to do them in any given legislative session.
Without question.
Right? You could, and so you can play that to your advantage on defense for a while. You can, as long as you can slow it down a little bit, then you get past the funnel or what have you, and you're on to, okay, the session's ended, nothing happened. But legislators remember they've heard about this topic before, and they get very annoyed when stakeholders won't work in good faith with other stakeholders to try and work these things out. If you can work out with other stakeholder groups and you get some compromise and you drop that compromise on the right committee's chairman's desk, you can get that done pretty readily, okay? But if you keep saying no, then eventually that idea is kicking around and they've heard it enough and they get annoyed that you're not participating in any kind of negotiation, and then guess what? Something gets passed.
Well, so that's exactly right. Bring this around to the issue of property taxes, local government spending, which is really I think the issue that at least our organization is working on right now at the Capitol. We have offered several different ideas. I mean, if you go back and again, another plug for the ITR Foundation Property Tax Toolkit, there's a lot of ideas in there, and we're talking about over a period of years, bending down the curve in the growth of property taxes. I suspect that local governments and the various stakeholders around that are going to be in opposition to most of them. But where's the idea? Because they would rather say, well, our citizens need these services and we can't do this, or we're going to have to cut police and fire. Well, what I do know your citizens are upset about is what they pay in property taxes. Talk to any legislator that was just out on the campaign trail. Just go talk to your neighbors or the ITR Foundation poll that shows that over 70% of Iowans think they pay too much in property taxes. The political will is there because the people want it. They want solutions. But they should know that it's incumbent on them to come to the table and start trying to figure out how can we improve this system in a way that works for everyone? Because if they don't, they're going to get something they really don't like. And I feel like that's starting to percolate.
I think it is. And I think the lesson of school choice reform, the lesson of collective bargaining reform is that for local government, for cities and counties in particular, we'll put schools off maybe in a different category for a minute, that we're not quite to the point where the legislature is just going to say, fine, top down, boom, here you go. Like it or not, here's the reform. But we're getting there, right? And the sense is building that local government is not engaging on, okay, how can we meaningfully reduce that curve in what cities and counties are spending? And there could be opportunities. I mean, if I were to put myself in the room with the League of Cities or the Counties Association, I mean, have a dialogue. Look to some things that, are there things that the state has mandated on cities and counties that could be adjusted, that could be repealed? I mean, we're in an environment where regulatory reform is happening. Cities and counties should be a partner in that. Yep. Look around for some state mandates that maybe you don't like or are antiquated or could be adjusted to be less expensive for taxpayers in the end. And maybe there's opportunities for saving just from that kind of regulatory relief. But if you don't identify those things, you don't work in good faith, then it's going to be an across-the-board solution that you have no input in. I think one of the things that's an interesting part of this, and I know you've touched on this in the podcast before, Chris, but it's worth talking about, is the nature of the property tax system that funds cities and counties and schools has built into it a lack of transparency. And it's not anything sinister, it's not anybody's fault, but it's just how you come up with a final number for property taxes. And that is your base number, and I'm not going to try and do all the math here, but the base number is what is the value of assessed property in the community? And then what tax rate gets applied to that, okay? And so, these local governments can hide a lot of increases because, interest rates are low and the assessment process says these values are going up for property, and you can mask a lot of increase in the dollars that flow into local government, even if those local governments keep their tax rate the same, even if they reduce it. If the assessed value goes up 10% and you cut your rate by 5%, that's still a net increase in the amount of money to local government. But it's that lack of transparency. Right. And you start talking to local voters about what's going on, why your property tax bill is like this, and you point your finger at the school board or you point your finger at the assessor. Nobody takes responsibility for it. It's a much different thing than the state budget, state income taxes.
The number that matters is the number that the individual homeowner or business owner or whoever, what's the number on the check? That's the number that matters. rollback, equalization, assessment, millage rate, special levies, all of that stuff matters when you want to try and unpack it. But what people care about is that my individual tax burden goes up every year. And so like we need to focus on that number if we're talking about transparency. We're trying to find ways either through our own work as a family of organizations to bring more information to people, to provide that transparency, and trying to find ways to encourage the legislature to pass things that bring greater transparency to the process. There's things we can do that we're setting out to take those first steps so that, as we've talked along today, that it's not, the first step doesn't have to be the heavy-handed, and I don't even want to call it heavy-handed, but to encourage this process of coming to the table and making it simpler. And we're trying to do that. We're trying to be part of the solution here. So, well, gentlemen, we are about out of time. So, Alan, you've always got a lot on your mind. Was there another big thing, a big idea that you were going to leave us with today, or?
I think it's just people need to remember local government matters. The turnout in city and school elections sometimes isn't very good.
Yeah.
Remember city and school elections coming up this fall in November. You elect your county board of supervisors and other county officials at the general election in even-numbered years. The size and scope of local government. I mean, the state budget is, $8.3 billion. Local government is roughly about 3.4 billion. About half your property tax bill, a little bit more, is your school board. Pay attention to what's going on in your local community. Run for office. Step up and serve. Don't just complain. And I think the more engagement that happens at the local level with voters, the better off this policy debate is, because it's that sense of accountability that cities and counties need to have to their local taxpayers. And if people are showing up at meetings, if they're showing up at a budget hearing and asking, why are we spending more money? If they're asking, do we really need an aquatic center? Do we really need whatever kind of vanity project that's going on in your community that may not be an absolute strict necessity? Be engaged, and that will fix a lot of these problems.
That's very well said, Alan, and we'll have plenty of reminders of that along the way. It reminds me, though, that we will have some information up at itrfoundation.org, because there are in several communities in Iowa bond referendums coming up in early March. And most of them are school bonding referendums, but a few cities. And so those are out there, and voters need to educate themselves on it, not just on the merits of whether or not that level of debt is appropriate, but knowing where to vote, and that this is coming around, because a lot of Iowa voters aren't attuned to a March election, but yet it could make a big difference in their community with their own property tax bill. So we're gonna try to be part of that solution of getting that civic engagement jump started. So thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to be on, Chris. Thanks.
Good. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you. Don't forget to like and subscribe, share with your friends, share your neighbors, tell your neighbors goldfish, but that we want to get the message out. And with that, we will see you next time.